Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. We're in week 31 and this week we are going to make a lovely floral panel for our garden quilt. If you're new here and you haven't seen any of the videos in this series, I will link the playlist at the top of the screen. That has got all of the videos so far, all the panels that we've made. And if you don't fancy making a quilt, a lot of our videos will work as standalone projects. And this one is a really good example of that, so do check out those videos. I'm working on my green fabric background. This is a 20 by 20 centimetre block, and this week we're going to focus mostly on embroidery, and so I don't actually have very much else on my table. I do have a scrap of fabric. We're going to do a small piece of paper piecing. I've got a heat erase pen, a pencil, my paper scissors and some embroidery scissors, and I've got my anchor threads which I've been using all the way through this project. So I've got my white 001, pink which is 025, red 046, blue 130, I've got my pale yellow which is 300, we haven't used this one for a while, my bright yellow 298, mid green which is 258, my lighter green which is 255, and my darkest green which is 683. Now I have got a template for this week. This is almost purely an embroidery pattern. Don't feel obliged to download this. It costs £1. It's just a nominal charge to help cover the cost of making these videos. If you feel confident sketching out your own design, then absolutely go for it. We're only going to use a handful of basic stitches, but use them in different ways to create lots of different effects. Now I will try and explain as we're going along, but if you need slower instructions and more detailed instructions, I do have a playlist of stitch tutorials where you'll find all of the stitches that I'm going to use today. I'll link that at the top of the screen as well. I'm going to start by transferring my pattern onto my fabric, and I've got a light box, but you could just line up your fabric with the outer square of the template and just hold it up to a window. That's absolutely fine as long as you've got light behind it. I've got my heat erase pen and I'm just transferring the guidelines onto my fabric. Now I'm racing through this a little bit. I do have more detailed videos on how to do this, but I've transferred the shapes for the pot separately onto a little piece of scrap paper, and I'm just cutting those out with my paper scissors, and we're going to use these to form some shapes to applique onto our background fabric. So I'm just lining up my paper so that there's a border all around it on my little scrap of blue fabric, and I'm starting by putting a little cross in the centre of that just to hold the paper in place and avoid it slipping as I'm stitching it. So holding my thread out of the way, I'm now just going to trim around the shape of that pot, leaving a border all around, and I'm going to fold over my fabric so that it's tightly folded against the edge of the paper without buckling the paper, and I'm going to catch that in place with a stitch. You'll notice I'm using a very strongly coloured thread. That's so that I can see it easily, because these stitches are not going to stay, we'll take them out. I've got a curve at the bottom of this pot. You can see me there just pleating the blue fabric with my thumbnails and putting stitches over the top to hold it in place. And I work like that all the way around, just making sure that the corners are folded flat, and sometimes you might need to take a little scrap of fabric off, so I'm just snipping the corner there and I'm flattening out the fabric across the corner and then folding over the top side of the pot, and that means that I'm going to get a sharp corner with no fabric poking out beyond the edge of the fabric shape that I'm trying to make. I'm just catching that in place with a stitch. Now I'm going to carry on in the same way along the top, but because we've got a concave curve here, our fabric is not going to want to follow that very nicely at all. So what we need to do is make some space, and I do that by putting a little snip just in the middle of that concave curve. And you can see that as I pull my fabric tight over the edge, that slit will open up to create a little notch, and that's going to help us get a really neat and sharp shape on a concave curve. So we just need to allow the fabric some freedom to move in the way that it wants to. And then I carry on all the way around the pot. I'm going to press that with an iron just to set those folds, and then I'm going to line up my pot piece on the guidelines on my backing fabric, pin it in place, and just use an applique stitch to hold that in place. So I'm bringing my needle up through both the backing fabric and the fabric shape, and then I'm going to take it back down through just the backing fabric with the needle tucked right up against the edge of the blue shape. I can rock my needle forward to catch the next stitch, and I'm going to carry on in the same way all the way around. When I'm close to the end but with a little bit of space left, I'm going to take out my black stitches and hook out the paper, and then finish stitching that shape down. And then I'm going to add my second pot piece in exactly the same way over the top. So now I'm going to start on the embroidery. I've got 2 strands of my darkest green here, and I'm going to add some canter embroidery just to give a little bit of depth and dimension to our picture, and to help the pot look like it's anchored in space rather than just floating. I've used all 3 of my green shades to make that look like it's receding into the background. I've got a single strand of my mid green and a single strand of my light green threaded into my needle, so we're blending threads a little bit. I'm going to start the embroidery on the florals in the pot. We're going to start with the greenery. I'm going to start with fly stitch, so I'm bringing my needle up on the left, looping it across and going back down on the right, and bringing my needle up in the centre of those 2 points, making sure the loop passes under the needle. So up on one side, down on the other, rock the needle forward in between, make sure the working thread is under the needle and pull through. And then I'm going to move down a little way and rock my needle back out to the left. So these are V-shaped stitches joined together by a straight stitch. So we're almost making interlocking Y shapes. And I'm going to work all the way down that strand in the middle, and then I'll add a couple of other strands of fly stitch at different points in the pot. You can see I'm stopping halfway down because the rest of that space is going to be filled with florals. So now I've got 1 strand of my mid green and 1 strand of my darkest green, and I'm going to put in some feather stitch leaves. So we make this in almost exactly the same way. We make our V shape, but rather than putting in a straight stitch stalk here, I'm going to make another V shape straight away. So I'm going out to the right and making another V shape stitch, and then I work back to the left. You can see me turning my fabric all the time here just to get the angle right. Then back over to the right to make our V shape, and then back over to the left. And you can alternate like this, or you can do it completely random. So you might do 2 to the left, 3 to the right, 1 to the left, 2 to the right, that kind of thing. So you can play around with this stitch in whatever way you like, but I'm putting in a few stems of feather stitch as well. So now we're going to use back stitch and detached chain stitch, and I'm going to start by making a line of back stitch. So I'm bringing my needle up a little way away from where I want my line to start, and then going back to the beginning of the line, and then rock forward 2 stitch lengths to leave a gap, and then back to meet the previous stitch. And I'm just going to stitch a line of back stitch all the way up to where I want my stem to end. Trying to keep my stitches nice and even. Now I'm at the end and I'm going to put in a detached chain stitch, so I'm looping my thread around. I'm taking my needle back down at the point where the thread comes out, then I bring my needle up inside that loop that I've made and pull through, and then hop my needle over the little loop that I've caught to put an anchor stitch to hold it in place. Then I've come down my back stitch line one stitch and I'm putting a little detached chain that goes off to the left. Then coming down one more back stitch and I'm going to put in a little detached chain that goes out to the right. So you can see me there catching that loop, hopping over the end to put the anchor stitch in place. And I'm going to work down the stem, alternating detached chain stitches from right to left at the bottom of each back stitch. Just going to put in a couple more stems like that. Now putting in our greenery gives us a sense of the shape. It's a little bit like when you do a flower arrangement. We start with our structure first and then we can fill in the gaps. So I thought we'd start with something easy. We've just been doing detached chain stitches. I've got 2 strands of my pink thread here. Let's put in some small lazy daisies. We're going to make a detached chain stitch, loop our thread around, take the needle back in at the same point where the thread came out and catch that loop, and then hop over the edge of the loop to put a little anchor stitch in place. Now I'm going to come back up at the centre and do the same again at a slightly different angle, and we're basically going to work our way around that circle, positioning 5 detached chain stitches, all starting from that centre point, and that will give us a little daisy shape that's really cute, one of the simplest flowers that you can stitch. I think we've used these all over our quilt, and as I've said before, we're going to try and harmonise our quilt, not just with the colours, but with the motifs and the stitches that we use in all of our blocks. So lazy daisies have appeared a lot all around our quilt. So I'm just going to use the smallest circles on the template to position lazy daisies, but the template is just a guide. You can use your judgment and put them in wherever you feel they belong. So I've just worked around the outside for the time being. I will come back and backfill the centre, but I want to put in our bigger flowers before I do that. So here's another easy flower for you. I've got 2 strands of my bright yellow here, and we're going to make something that looks a little bit like a dandelion. So I'm bringing my needle up at the outside edge of the circle. I'm using our medium-sized circles to position these, and I'm just going to make a series of straight stitches around the circle. So I'm always working from the outside edge of the circle and back into the centre, and you can see I've just hopped over there. That's just so that I am working at a comfortable angle with my hand. You can rotate round, or you can do opposite stitches all the way around the circle if you want to, whatever feels most comfortable for you. So up at the edge, in at the centre, and then rock the needle back out to the edge of the circle, and then come back down at the centre. And I'm not being particularly fussy about making sure these are perfectly spaced. Sometimes I think a little bit of unevenness in your stitching makes things look a lot more organic and natural, and I actually quite like a little bit of randomness here and there. But that's my little dandelion head, and I'm going to put a few of those in where I've got medium-sized circles on my pattern. So I've put some of those in and I'm really liking this already. Now I'm going to do something slightly different on our 3 largest circles. I'm drawing a smaller circle in the centre of them just as a guide for my stitching. So I've got those 3 large circles there at the centre, and we're going to make something like a gerbera or gazania here. I've got 2 strands of red, and I'm going to work something that's similar to a lazy daisy. So I'm using my detached chain stitches again here, but this time rather than coming up at the very centre, I'm starting my stitches at the edge of that small circle. So my stitches are all going to start on the outside edge of that centre circle and finish on the edge of the large circle, and this is going to create a ring of detached chain stitches with a void in the centre, and we're going to put in some more stitches at the centre to create the middle for our flower. So I'm just working my way around, trying to make sure my stitches are angled nicely, so not all pointing in the same direction but angling around the circle as I work. And sometimes you can see I work my loop to the right, sometimes to the left. I'm simply following here the natural curl of the thread. So if the thread wants to go to the right, don't try and force it to go to the left, because you'll get a twisted stitch if you do that. So just let the thread tell you which direction it wants to curve in, and you'll get a much better finish. So you can see that that void is starting to form now. So now I've got 2 strands of my light yellow, and we're going to fill that void at the centre with French knots. So I've brought my thread through, holding the thread towards myself and wrapping it over the needle twice. Then I'm going to take my needle back down through the fabric, keeping hold of that working thread so that it stays taut until the last moment. Try not to take your needle down at the same point that the thread comes out. Make sure there's a little bit of fabric caught, just a couple of threads on the weave of the fabric will do it. But if you take your needle back down at exactly the same point that the thread comes out, your French knot will just pull through to the back, and you might as well not have bothered. So just make sure you're catching some fabric when you take your needle back through. And French knots work best when you keep your thread under tension. So you can see I'm holding that working thread until the last moment when I pull my thread back through the fabric, and I'm just going to fill that space with French knots, packing them quite closely together, and that fills all the space and means that you'll have no green fabric showing through. It always takes more French knots than you think you need. So that's my flower. I'm going to put the other 2 in, and then we'll look at another type of flower. These are going to be something like lavender that we're going to work on now. So I'm adding in a couple of extra stems where I think there might be scope to add something. And I've got 2 strands of my blue thread, and we're going to make this entirely with detached chain stitches. So my first stitch is going to point directly out from the end of the stem, and I'm making a really small detached chain stitch there at the top of the stem. Now I'm moving down the stem a little bit, and I'm going to make my next detached chain stitch to angle just slightly off to the left. So still pointing up, but slightly out to the left so that it sits just to the side of that first stitch. Then I'm going to move my needle down a little bit more along the stem and make a little stitch that moves slightly out to the right, and catch that in place. and we're going to work down the length of the stem, making these little pairs of detached chain stitches that point out to the left and to the right, that are just ever so slightly angled away from centre, and that will make them kind of overlap slightly, and it will look like a little cluster of flower heads or buds that are all grouped together on the end of the stem, a little bit like lavender. So I'm off to the right now. And then down the stem a little bit, and a stitch off to the left. Now, depending on how large your little stitches are, you might also want to add another stitch at the centre, just overlapping a little bit, so it looks like some of the little buds are pointing towards you, but I'm keeping my stitches so tiny that I didn't feel like I needed to add that extra layer. I thought it would just look too cluttered. So I'm working my way all the way down the stem, and I just thought this seemed to come to life once I'd put some blue into the picture. So I've put in some extra stems there, and now I've got a single strand of white. We're going to make something that is a little bit like a dandelion seed head. So we're back to fly stitch, but we're going to use detached fly stitches here. So I put my thread up at the edge of one of the circles there, and I'm making my fly stitch to finish at the centre, and then I go round my circle a little bit and make another fly stitch that ends at the centre. So this is just the Y-shaped stitch, so it's the V and the stalk all worked into the centre of the flower, and I'm keeping these very small again, so I'm making really tiny V shapes so that they look wispy and light and airy. That's the look I'm going for. So I'm working my way around the circle just like we did with our straight stitch. I'm angling the fly stitches like numbers on a clock as I work my way around that circle. So once I've worked my way around the circle, I thought it needed a little bit more depth, and so I made another circuit around using slightly smaller stitches. So you can see me bringing my needle up about halfway out from the centre of the circle, and I make another layer of detached fly stitches over the top of the ones I've already put in place, just to make my dandelion clock look a little bit more three-dimensional. So then it's just a case of adding flowers to fill in any gaps. So you can see me adding some flowers here that overlap the edge of the pot. That's to make it look like flowers are spilling over. And you probably can also see that I've created some tiny little white flowers just using straight stitches again, but keeping it really small. So here's my finished block. I do wish the bottom of that pot was a little bit more even, but I'll live, it's fine. And I just really enjoyed the process of this one. It wasn't a quick block, I won't lie. It did take several hours, but it was so therapeutic and enjoyable. And it's got a lovely balance of improvising and following a template as well. And we've actually hardly used any stitches. We've just played with them. So we've got our running stitch that we used for our canther. We've got our detached chain stitches. I've added in some French knots. We used feather stitch, and we've got some fly stitch as well. And we've got our little flowers that are made of straight stitches, so the yellow ones and these little white ones, and a bit of back stitch for some of the stems. So we've only maybe used 5 or 6 stitches, but because we've played around with them, the result looks really varied. You would never know looking at this that there are so few stitches involved. So if I bring it up a bit closer, you can see some of the ways that I've filled in. You can see I've added some little yellow centres, and I've made some little trefoils using a single strand of blue and pink, and I've just put 3 detached chain stitches together in a little trio there just to fill in the gaps. And I am so happy with this one. I think it's beautiful, and I hope you are going to enjoy it too. So do share your versions of the floral pot at #FSH23quilt, and if you have enjoyed this and would like to support our channel, please do hit that like button. We appreciate it so much. It helps other people find our videos, helps us more than you can imagine. I will link some similar projects over here if you want to do more embroidery, and if you want to follow all of our videos and get some more embroidery inspiration, just click on our logo down here. That will subscribe you to our channel, and we just love it when you want to be part of our community. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great week stitching your floral pot. I can't wait to see the results, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!